Mason Reynolds, a decorated Army veteran, was peacefully sleeping in his rural Montana cabin when the smell of smoke jolted him awake. As flames engulfed the structure, his loyal German shepherd, Shadow, pushed him through a window to safety, but never emerged from the blazing cabin. 2 years passed, filled with grief, hospital stays, and fragmented memories. While volunteering at a local animal shelter on its final day before closing, Mason locked eyes with a severely depressed German shepherd in the corner cage, and the dog's immediate reaction to his scent made Mason's blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Pine Ridge. Montana was the kind of small town that winter seemed to claim for 8 months of the year, nestled against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. Its population of just under 3,000 souls had weathered economic hardships as logging and mining operations shuttered over the decades. What remained was a tight-knit community where everyone knew not just your name, but your business, whether you wanted them to or not. Mason Reynolds had returned to his hometown 3 years ago after his honorable discharge, seeking solitude and healing. At 35, the former Army K-9 handler carried more than just the physical scars from his tours in Afghanistan. The nightmares and startled responses had made civilian life nearly impossible in busier places. His therapist had called it PTSD. Mason called it Tuesday and called. Tall, with broad shoulders that now hunched slightly, Mason's once military-precise appearance had softened. His brown hair, now past regulation length, often fell across eyes that had seen too much. The locals knew to approach him slowly and to never come up behind him unannounced. What they didn't know was how much worse things had been before Shadow came into his life. The German shepherd had been a rescue himself, a washout from police training deemed too gentle for police work. From the moment Mason had brought the 8-month-old dog home, something had clicked between them. Shadow seemed to sense the nightmares coming before Mason himself knew, waking him before the worst of the terror hit. On bad days, the dog would press his solid weight against Mason's leg, grounding him when memories threatened to sweep him away. Abigail Abby Whitaker had been the one to suggest Shadow as a companion. As director of the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, she'd developed an uncanny ability to match animals with the humans who needed them most. Her gentle demeanor and unwavering dedication to the shelter belied a fierce determination that had kept the doors open despite dwindling funding. At 29, her blonde hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail, Abby had become one of the few people Mason truly trusted. Derek Thompson, on the other hand, represented everything Mason had come to distrust about bureaucracy. As the shelter board's treasurer, the 45-year-old businessman approached animal welfare with cold calculations rather than compassion. Practical decisions, he called them, though Mason had other words for Derek's policies, none of them polite. Sheriff James Callahan and Dr. Sarah Mitchell rounded out the people Mason reluctantly allowed into his carefully constructed world. Before the fire, Mason had been healing. Shadow had been the bridge between his isolated existence and rejoining the human race, and then, in one night of flames and chaos, it had all changed. Mason still dreamed of the fire most nights. It always started the same way, the peaceful sleep shattered by Shadow's urgent barking. The night of December 18th, 2020, had been brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below zero, making the old cabin's wood stove work overtime. Whether it was a stray ember or faulty wiring, the fire marshal could never say for certain. The result was the same. Mason, wake up! He remembered Sheriff Callahan's voice cutting through the chaos as firefighters worked to contain the blaze. Where's Shadow? Mason had tried to push past the sheriff, his lungs burning from the smoke he'd already inhaled. He was right behind me. He pushed me out. He was right there. The memory fragmented after that point. The doctor later explained that the combination of smoke inhalation, a concussion from his fall from the window, and the emotional trauma had affected his memory formation. Mason remembered being restrained as firefighters declared it was too dangerous to enter. He remembered the crack and roar as the roof collapsed. He didn't remember passing out, though they told him he had. The days following were a blur of hospital rooms and well-meaning visitors. Burns on his arms and back required skin grafts. His lungs needed time to heal, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache that formed as day after day passed with no sign of Shadow. We didn't find any remains, Fire Chief Wilson had told him gently. 3 days after the fire. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. The temperature of that fire was extreme. But Mason had clung to hope. As soon as he was released from the hospital, still wrapped in bandages and against medical advice, he had organized search parties. Neighbors, friends, even strangers touched by the story combed the woods surrounding the cabin ruins, calling Shadow's name until their voices grew hoarse. He's microchipped, Mason had insisted to anyone who would listen. He has tags. Someone will find him. He'd posted flyers in every business in Pine Ridge and the neighboring towns. He'd called every shelter and veterinary office within a 100-mile radius. He'd offered a reward that he couldn't afford. Each day without Shadow, the fragmented memories of their life together tormented him more. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had explained that traumatic brain injuries could affect memory. But that didn't make the gaps any less frustrating. Some days Mason could perfectly recall training sessions with Shadow, the precise commands, the proud wag of the dog's tail when he succeeded. Other days, he struggled to remember what Shadow's fur felt like beneath his fingers. The brain protects itself, Dr. Mitchell had explained during one of their weekly sessions. Sometimes those memories are still there, just temporarily inaccessible. As weeks turned to months, the search efforts dwindled. The bitter Montana winter made continued outdoor searches dangerous. The sympathetic looks from townsfolk began to shift from compassion to pity. People stopped mentioning Shadow's name around Mason. 6 months after the fire, Sheriff Callahan had sat Mason down at the town diner, ordering coffee for them both before speaking. Mason, I say this as someone who cares about you. You need to consider the possibility that Shadow isn't coming home. Mason had stared into his coffee cup, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. I can't stop looking, he'd said quietly. I'm not saying stop hoping, the sheriff had replied, his weathered face softening. But maybe start healing too. That conversation had been a turning point of sorts. Mason had begun rebuilding his life literally and figuratively. With insurance money and help from fellow veterans, he started construction on a new, smaller cabin on the same property. He accepted more carpentry jobs around town, finding that physical labor helped quiet his mind. And on Abby's suggestion, he began volunteering at the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter. At first, just a few hours each week, helping with repairs the shelter couldn't afford to hire out, then more regularly, finding an unexpected peace in the simple routines of caring for animals who asked nothing of him but kindness. You have a way with the difficult ones? Abby had commented after Mason had coaxed a traumatized beagle to eat from his hand after days of rejecting food. They sense something in you. Mason had shrugged it off, but he knew what the animals sensed. They recognized a kindred brokenness, the wounded recognizing the wounded. Still, each time a German shepherd appeared at the shelter or was mentioned in regional lost and found pet notices, Mason's heart would race. He had followed leads to neighboring counties, once driving nearly 4 hours in a snowstorm only to find a Belgian Malinois mix that looked nothing like Shadow. Each disappointment carved the hollow place inside him a little deeper. As the second anniversary of the fire approached, Mason had reluctantly accepted what everyone had been telling him. Shadow was gone. The best tribute he could offer was to help other animals in need. He had stopped actively searching, though his eyes still scanned roadsides and forest edges out of habit. Hope had become a dull ache he carried rather than an active flame. Until today. The Pine Ridge Animal Shelter was dying a slow death of budget cuts and neglect. The old converted warehouse at the edge of town had served the community for nearly 30 years. But its peeling paint and rusting chain-link runs spoke of harder times. When Mason arrived for his regular Wednesday shift, the atmosphere inside was even more somber than usual. "It's official," Abby said without preamble, her normally cheerful face drawn with worry. She handed Mason a letter bearing the county seal. 30 days. That's all the time we have left. Mason scanned the document. Bureaucratic language spelling out the shelter's death sentence. Funding discontinued. Property reassignment. Dissolution of operations. The final paragraph outlined the humane transfer of remaining animals to the county facility, a high-kill shelter 60 miles away. "There has to be something we can do," Mason said, handing back the letter. Abby pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Mason had come to recognize as her gathering courage. "Derek's called an emergency board meeting for tonight. I'm going to propose an emergency fundraising campaign, but—" She trailed off, the unspoken odds hanging between them. "I'll be there," Mason promised. He rarely attended official shelter business, preferring to keep his contributions physical rather than political. But this was different. This was war. Abby's smile was tired, but genuine. "Clean up in Kennel 3, first new arrival yesterday, and nobody can get near him." Mason nodded, grabbing gloves and cleaning supplies from the utility closet. The shelter layout was familiar after months of volunteering. Intake room to the right, cat room to the left. Main kennel area straight ahead with 20 individual runs. Kennel 3 was halfway down on the left, normally reserved for larger dogs. The snarling started before Mason even reached the gate. Deep, warning growls from a shadowed corner were punctuated by sharp barks that echoed against the concrete floors. "Easy there," Mason said softly, not making eye contact as he unlatched the gate. Years of working with military canines had taught him the language of anxious dogs. This one wasn't aggressive, it was terrified. The German shepherd huddled in the far corner, teeth bared in warning. Its coat was dull and patchy in places, ribs visible beneath thin fur. But it was the dog's eyes that caught Mason's attention, vacant, yet somehow haunted, as if it had seen things no dog should have to see. Mason worked methodically, keeping his movements slow and predictable as he changed the water bowl and cleaned around the untouched food dish. The dog never took its eyes off him, but made no move to attack. "Not much of an appetite, huh?" Mason said conversationally, keeping his voice low and even. "That's okay. No rush." When he finished and backed out of the kennel, Abby was watching from the central aisle. "That's the closest anyone's gotten," she said. "He was found up near Whitaker Pass 2 weeks ago. Some hikers reported him hanging around their campsite. Animal control set a humane trap after he wouldn't come to anyone. Any ID microchip? Abby shook her head. Nothing. Doc Miller thinks he's about 4 years old. No obvious signs of injury, but he's severely malnourished and... She hesitated. Well, Doc says he shows signs of smoke inhalation damage to his lungs. Old damage. Scarred over. Mason's eyes snapped back to the German shepherd, studying him more intently. The coloring was right black and tan in a classic saddle pattern. The size could be right, too, though it was hard to tell with the dog so thin. But Shadow had distinctive white markings on his chest and one paw. This dog's coat was too dirty to tell. Has he... Mason had to clear his throat before continuing. Does he react to any particular name? The sympathy in Abby's eyes told him she understood exactly what he was asking. We've tried everything. Mason, I'm sorry. That evening, the shelter's small meeting room was packed with board members and concerned volunteers. Derek Thompson stood at the head of the table, his expensive suit out of place among the shelter's shabby furnishings. The financial reality is unavoidable, Derek stated, tapping a stack of spreadsheets. We've been operating at a deficit for over 18 months. The county can't justify further emergency funding. We haven't tried everything, Abby countered, presenting her hastily prepared proposal for a community fundraising drive. 30 days is enough time to organize at least one major event. The Founders Day Festival is in 3 weeks. We could set up a booth, hold a special adoption day. Derek's dismissive chuckle sparked a flare of anger in Mason's chest. Always the optimist. Abigail, Derek said. But let's be realistic. This shelter has been a financial drain on the county for years. Even if, and it's a big if you raised enough for 1 more month. What then? The structural problems remain. Mason leaned forward. Maybe the problem isn't the shelter. Maybe it's the leadership. A tense silence fell across the room. Derek's face flushed red. You're out of line. Reynolds, he snapped. You're not even a board member. No, I'm just someone who's seen what this shelter means to the community, Mason replied, surprised by his own boldness. These animals deserve better than a death sentence because of spreadsheets. The meeting devolved into heated arguments after that. By the time it ended, nothing had been resolved except that the 30-day countdown stood firm. Abby had permission to attempt fundraising, but with the clear expectation of failure. Later that night, as Mason cleared debris from his property, a task he'd been putting off for months, his shovel struck something metallic beneath ash and soil, brushing away the dirt. He found Shadow's old food bowl, miraculously intact though blackened by flames. The discovery sent a rush of memories through him, suddenly vivid and clear. Shadow as a puppy, clumsily chasing the bowl across the kitchen floor. Shadow patiently waiting for the command to eat. Shadow nudging the empty bowl toward Mason with his nose, a not-so-subtle hint for seconds. Mason sat heavily on the ground, clutching the bowl, tears streaming unbidden down his face. For the first time in months, he dreamed of Shadow that night, not of the fire, but of running together through mountain meadows, whole and happy. He woke at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time the fire had started, with an overwhelming urge to go to the shelter. Miles away, in the darkness of Kennel 3, a German shepherd woke at the same moment and began to howl. The next morning, Mason arrived at the shelter earlier than usual. Shadow's blackened food bowl wrapped in a towel and tucked into his truck's glove compartment. He wasn't ready to share this discovery yet, not with Abby, not with anyone. The emotional storm it had triggered felt too raw, too personal. Abby was already there, dark circles under her eyes betraying a sleepless night. She barely looked up from the adoption paperwork she was organizing when Mason walked in. "I'm making flyers for an emergency adoption event next weekend," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Maybe if we can place even half of the animals before closure. That's fewer going to county." Mason nodded, hanging his worn leather jacket on the hook by the door. "Need help with anything?" "Everything," she sighed, then offered a weak smile. "But you can start with the morning feeding. Angela called in sick." The morning routine provided a welcome structure. Mason methodically worked his way down the line of kennels, filling food bowls, refreshing water, and offering brief moments of connection with each animal. The cacophony of barks and whines that usually accompanied feeding time helped drown out his troubled thoughts. When he reached Kennel 3, he paused. The German Shepherd was still huddled in the back corner, but something had changed. The dog's eyes tracked his movements with a new intensity, and though the low growl continued, it seemed more perfunctory than threatening. "Brought you breakfast," Mason said quietly, sliding the food bowl toward the dog without making direct eye contact. "No pressure." For the first time, the shepherd shifted position slightly, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. Mason felt a strange jolt in his chest recognition, perhaps, though he immediately dismissed the thought as wishful thinking. He'd been down this road too many times before. "There was a call while you were in back," Abby said when Mason returned to the front desk. "Someone spotted a stray near the old Carson property. Might be that collie mix we've been looking for since last week." Mason grabbed his keys. "I'll check it out." "Take my car," Abby suggested, tossing him her keys. "Your truck's been sounding rough. And Mason," she added as he turned to leave. "The fundraising committee is meeting at the diner tonight. 6 o'clock. I could use your support." The Carson property yielded no sign of the collie, but the trip wasn't wasted. As Mason drove back through town, he found himself stopping at the library, a place he rarely visited. Something was nagging at him about the German Shepherd in Kennel 3, something beyond his own desperate wish for it to be Shadow. The town librarian, Mrs. Hancock, had known Mason since he was a boy struggling with reading. She didn't ask questions when he requested old newspaper archives from December 2020 through February 2021, just led him to a microfiche machine that looked like it belonged in a museum. For the next 2 hours, Mason scrolled through local news coverage of the fire and its aftermath. There wasn't much. Pine Ridge was too small for its own newspaper, and the regional papers had only given the cabin fire a brief mention. He was about to give up when a small article from January 18, 2021 caught his eye. It wasn't about the fire at all, but about a series of unusual livestock deaths near Whitaker Pass. "Local ranchers report unexplained cattle deaths," the headline read. The article described 3 separate incidents where cattle had been found dead, with precise wounds to the throat not consistent with wolf or mountain lion attacks. One rancher reported seeing a large dog-like animal near his property before the incidents. Mason's pulse quickened. Whitaker Pass was where the German Shepherd had been found, and January 2021 was just weeks after the fire. Could Shadow, trained in combat techniques, have survived and reverted to hunting to stay alive? The timing and location made it possible, unlikely, but possible. He made copies of the article and several others that mentioned similar incidents, then hesitated before leaving. On impulse, he asked Mrs. Hancock if there were any records of the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter board meetings. "Public organization," she confirmed. "They have to maintain records. Should be on file with the county clerk." A trip to the county administration building yielded another discovery. Derek Thompson had only joined the shelter board 6 months ago, right around the time the funding crisis had intensified. Prior to that, he had opposed several county funding measures for the shelter through his position at the local bank. More interesting still, his name appeared on a planning committee for commercial development in the very area where the shelter stood. By the time Mason arrived at the diner that evening, his mind was churning with possibilities and questions. The shelter's small fundraising committee had taken over 2 tables in the back. Mason recognized most of the faces, regular volunteers, a few local business owners, Dr. Miller, who provided veterinary services. Abby looked surprised but pleased to see him. "I didn't think this was your kind of thing." "Neither did I," Mason admitted, sliding into the empty seat beside her. He chose not to mention his day's research yet. Without concrete proof, his suspicions about Derek Thompson would sound like paranoid conspiracy theories. The meeting was both hopeful and heartbreaking. Ideas flowed freely, a silent auction, a dog wash, a community picnic with adoption opportunities. Local businesses pledged donations and space for collection jars. But beneath the enthusiasm ran a current of resignation. Even if wildly successful, these efforts might extend the shelter's life by a month or 2, not save it permanently. "What about a long-term solution?" Mason finally asked during a lull in the conversation. "Has anyone looked into converting to a non-profit structure, independent from county funding?" Abby exchanged glances with Dr. Miller. "It would require a complete reorganization, new board, bylaws, fundraising structure, and property," Dr. Miller added. "The county owns the current building, but it could be done," Mason pressed. "With time." "Yes," Abby conceded. "But we'd need at least 6 months of planning and legal work. We have 30 days. After the meeting broke up, Mason lingered, waiting until he and Abby were alone before sharing what he'd discovered about Derek Thompson's potential conflict of interest. "You think he's deliberately sabotaging the shelter to get the property?" Abby asked, her voice low despite the nearly empty diner. "I think it's worth looking into," Mason replied. His sudden interest in shelter governance coincides with this development committee. At minimum, it's suspicious. Abby stirred her cold coffee thoughtfully. "Even if you're right, proving it wouldn't change our deadline. But it might rally community support," Mason argued. "People around here hate being manipulated even more than they hate spending money." Back at his half-rebuilt cabin that night, Mason couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the German Shepherd at the shelter. If there was even the slightest possibility it was Shadow, he needed to know. He dug through boxes of salvaged items until he found what he was looking for: Shadow's old training toy, a special tug made of fire hose material. It was smoke-damaged, but intact. The next morning, he arrived at the shelter as Abby was unlocking the doors. "I need to try something," he said by way of greeting. "With the shepherd in Kennel 3, Abby's expression was concerned but understanding. "Mason, I know what you're thinking, but I just need to be sure," he interrupted. "Please." She nodded slowly. "Do what you need to do. I'll make sure you're not disturbed." Mason approached Kennel 3 differently this time. Rather than the careful sideways approach he'd been using, he walked directly to the gate and sat down on the concrete floor just outside it. The German Shepherd watched him warily, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I need to know if it's you," Mason said quietly, taking the fire hose toy from his pocket. He didn't throw it or wave it, just held it where the dog could see and smell it. "I need to know if you're my shadow." The dog's nostrils flared, scenting the air. The growl faded, replaced by an intense stillness that made Mason's heart race. For 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing happened. The dog remained in its corner, watching. Mason remained seated, waiting. Then, almost imperceptibly, the shepherd's tail moved. Not a wag, barely a twitch, but movement nonetheless. "Remember this," Mason whispered, squeezing the toy to release its familiar squeak. "Remember how we used to play?" The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound, a reflexive response. Mason told himself, not recognition. But then the shepherd shifted position slightly, his body language softening almost imperceptibly. These small changes might mean nothing, or they might mean everything. Mason couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty was agonizing. Over the next week, Mason spent every available moment at the shelter. His carpentry jobs went on hold as he dedicated himself to 2 parallel missions, saving the shelter and determining if the German Shepherd in Kennel 3 was Shadow. Both felt like increasingly desperate long shots. The fundraising efforts were gaining momentum but falling far short of what was needed for long-term sustainability. Meanwhile, Mason's careful approaches to the German Shepherd yielded inconsistent results. Some days, the dog seemed to respond to Shadow's old commands, subtle ear movements, shifts in posture. Other days, he remained completely withdrawn, as if Mason were a stranger. "You're torturing yourself," Abby said gently after finding Mason sitting outside Kennel 3 long after the shelter had closed for the evening. "Even if it is Shadow, he's been through trauma we can't begin to understand. He might never be the dog you remember." "I know," Mason acknowledged, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can't give up on him. Not again." "The county transport comes in 12 days," Abby reminded him. "If you're going to adopt him, you need to start the paperwork." Mason hesitated. The thought of bringing home a dog, any dog, felt like a betrayal of Shadow's memory. But if this was Shadow, traumatized beyond recognition, could Mason provide the specialized care he needed? And if it wasn't Shadow, could Mason love a dog that had only his own projections and desperate wishes attached to it? "I need more time," he said finally. The following day, Mason arrived at the shelter to find Derek Thompson inspecting the property with 2 men in business suits. Derek's expression soured when he spotted Mason. "Here on official shelter business, I assume?" Derek asked, his tone making it clear what he thought the answer was. "I volunteer here," Mason replied evenly. "What's the official business today?" Derek gestured vaguely to the men beside him. "Preliminary assessment for county purposes, nothing that concerns volunteers." After they left, Mason found Abby in the file room, hastily wiping away tears. "They're already measuring for demolition," she said, her voice breaking. "Derek didn't even try to hide it. As soon as the animals are out, they're tearing it down for some new development." Mason felt cold anger crystallize in his chest. "I need to show you something." He led Abby out to his truck and retrieved the folder of research he'd compiled over the past week. Property records showing Derek's wife owned land adjacent to the shelter. Minutes from planning committee meetings where Derek had advocated for redevelopment of underutilized county properties. A preliminary site plan dated 6 months ago, showing a shopping complex where the shelter now stood. He's been planning this for months, Mason concluded. The budget crisis may be real, but he's been exacerbating it, steering the board away from solutions. Abby's hands trembled as she reviewed the documents. This is corrupt. But is it illegal? Conflict of interest at minimum, possibly fraud if he's been manipulating shelter finances to create this crisis. Mason hesitated, then added, "The question is, what do we do about it?" They spent the evening strategizing with Dr. Miller and Sheriff Callahan, who agreed the evidence was concerning but not yet conclusive. They needed more ideally financial records showing direct interference or misappropriation. The annual audit records should be in the shelter office. Abby realized, if Derek's been manipulating the books, there might be evidence there. Late that night, using her keys as shelter director, Abby and Mason returned to search the office files. What they found exceeded their expectations. Notes in Derek's handwriting detailing which funding opportunities to delay or misdirect, emails to county officials emphasizing the shelter's financial instability, and most damning of all, a proposed contract with Valley View developers that included a substantial consulting fee for Derek upon successful acquisition of the shelter property. "This is enough," Sheriff Callahan confirmed the next morning, reviewing their findings. "I'll bring this to the district attorney today." But legal wheels turned slowly, and they were still racing against the shelter's closure date. With just 10 days remaining, they decided to pursue multiple strategies simultaneously. Sheriff Callahan would handle the legal investigation. Abby would accelerate the fundraising and begin paperwork for transitioning to a nonprofit. And Mason would continue working with the German Shepherd, determined to reach him before time ran out. That afternoon, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Mason's therapist, stopped by the shelter with an unusual suggestion. "You've been telling me about this dog for weeks," she said after pulling Mason aside. "I've been thinking about your own trauma recovery. What triggers memories for you?" Mason considered the question. "Smells, sometimes. Certain sounds. Being in places where things happened." Sarah nodded. "The brain forms memory differently during traumatic events. But those memories are often stored with sensory information, smells, sounds, physical sensations. If this is Shadow, he might need a sensory bridge to connect his past and present." The idea sparked something in Mason. He'd been approaching this clinically, with training commands and familiar objects. But what if Shadow needed something more primal that evening? Mason drove to the ruins of his old cabin. The physical structure was long gone, but the foundation remained, along with the charred remnants of his former life. He collected a small bag of soil from where Shadow's bed had been kept, near the wood stove. The next morning, Mason entered Kennel 3 differently. He sat on the floor as usual, but this time emptied a small amount of the soil from his cabin onto a clean towel. The scent was subtle to human senses: ash, earth, and the faint ghost of home, but for a dog, it might speak volumes. The German Shepherd's reaction was immediate and heart-stopping. The dog lifted his head sharply, nostrils working frantically. For the first time, he left his corner voluntarily, approaching the towel with cautious steps. Mason held his breath as the dog sniffed deeply, then looked directly at Mason's face, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time. "Shadow," Mason whispered, hope and fear warring in his chest. Is it really you, boy? The dog inched closer, still sniffing. Then, in a movement so familiar, it made Mason's heart ache. The shepherd lowered his head and nudged Mason's hand with his nose, the exact gesture Shadow had always used to request petting. Mason's vision blurred with tears as he gently placed his hand on the dog's head. The shepherd didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a tremor running through his thin frame. "I found you," Mason whispered, his voice breaking. "I finally found you." The moment Shadow recognized Mason felt like the world shifting back into alignment after 2 years of being profoundly wrong. For several minutes, they remained frozen in their positions, Mason cross-legged on the concrete floor, Shadow leaning into his hand, both afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile reunion. Gradually, Shadow inched closer until his body pressed against Mason's knee. The dog was severely underweight, his once muscular frame now bony beneath dulled fur. When Mason carefully ran his hands along Shadow's sides, he could count each rib. A patchwork of old scars told stories of wilderness survival that Mason could only imagine. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" Mason murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow responded by pressing his head more firmly against Mason's hand, a gesture so achingly familiar that it made Mason's chest constrict. Abby found them like that 30 minutes later, her gasp of surprise causing Shadow to tense momentarily before relaxing again at Mason's reassuring touch. "Is it really him?" she whispered from the kennel entrance, keeping her distance to avoid disturbing the fragile connection. Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The mathematical improbability of this moment was staggering. That Shadow had survived the fire, lived wild for nearly 2 years, and somehow ended up at this specific shelter. Just days before its closure, it defied rational explanation. Yet, here they were. "We need to get him checked out," Abby said softly. "Dr. Miller should see him right away." The logistics of moving Shadow proved challenging. The dog refused to leave Mason's side, but was clearly terrified of the leash Abby offered. Eventually, they improvised with one of Mason's shirts wrapped around Shadow's neck, providing both security and his familiar scent. The walk to Mason's truck was slow and tense. Shadow pressed so tightly against Mason's leg that walking was difficult, his body trembling with anxiety at the open space and unfamiliar surroundings. Every sudden noise, a car door slamming, a bird taking flight, sent fresh waves of panic through the shepherd's frame. "It's okay," Mason repeated, maintaining a slow, steady pace. "I've got you now. You're safe." Dr. Miller's examination confirmed what they already knew. Shadow was severely malnourished and suffering from multiple healed injuries. X-rays revealed old fractures that had mended improperly, including 3 ribs and his right front leg. Most concerning was the damage to his lungs, consistent with severe smoke inhalation. "He's been through more than most animals could survive," Dr. Miller explained as he administered fluids and vitamins. "The fact that he's alive at all is remarkable. The lung damage explains the chronic cough you mentioned, and it's likely permanent to some degree." "Will he recover?" Mason asked, refusing to release Shadow's paw even as the vet worked around him. "Physically, with proper nutrition and care, much of his condition should improve," Dr. Miller said carefully. "The psychological trauma is harder to predict." "He's clearly attached to you, which is a very positive sign, but don't expect the dog you lost." This shadow has lived through experiences that have changed him fundamentally. As if to underscore the vet's point, a technician entering the room with additional supplies triggered Shadow into a defensive posture, a low growl rumbling from his chest until Mason calmed him with gentle words and touch. "Take him home," Dr. Miller advised, handing Mason medications and special food formulated for recovery. "Familiar surroundings and routine will help more than anything we can do here. But bring him back in 3 days for a follow-up." The drive to Mason's cabin was tense. Shadow refused to sit in the passenger seat or the back, instead crouching on the floor by Mason's feet, making driving hazardous. When they finally arrived, Mason carried the exhausted dog inside, settling him on a makeshift bed near the wood stove, positioned exactly where his bed had been in the old cabin. Shadow slept fitfully that first night, waking frequently with soft whimpers that tore at Mason's heart. Each time, Mason would slide from his own bed to the floor beside Shadow, offering reassurance until the dog settled again. By dawn, Mason had abandoned his bed entirely, sleeping on the floor with one hand resting on Shadow's side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. Morning brought new challenges. Shadow refused to eat from his bowl, taking food only from Mason's hand, and even then with obvious suspicion. The sound of running water sent him scrambling under the bed, where he remained, trembling, until Mason coaxed him out with patient words and treats. Outside was worse. Shadow refused to step beyond the porch, his body rigid with terror at the open space. When Mason tried to guide him with gentle pressure, Shadow pancaked to the ground, a behavior Mason recognized from severely traumatized military dogs he'd worked with overseas. "Okay, no pressure," Mason soothed, sitting beside the frightened dog. "We'll take it one day at a time." Mason called Abby to explain he wouldn't be at the shelter that day, then settled in for what he understood would be a long, difficult rehabilitation process. For the next 3 days, their world contracted to the small cabin and its immediate surroundings. Small victories, Shadow eating from his bowl, sleeping through the night, venturing 3 feet from the porch were celebrated like major breakthroughs. Dr. Miller's follow-up examination showed modest physical improvement, but he remained concerned about Shadow's psychological state. "I've dealt with abused and traumatized animals for 30 years, he told Mason privately, while a vet tech distracted Shadow with treats. "His attachment to you is extraordinary, but it's also concerning in its intensity. He displays significant anxiety whenever you're out of sight, even briefly." "He's afraid I'll disappear again," Mason said, the realization hitting him with painful clarity. "Just like I was afraid he was gone forever." Dr. Miller nodded. "Exactly. You're both suffering from attachment trauma. In some ways, you're the perfect person to rehabilitate him because you understand what he's going through. But it also means you need to be careful about your own emotional responses. Dogs are incredibly sensitive to our emotional states." The vet's words resonated deeply with Mason. In focusing on Shadow's trauma, he'd temporarily set aside his own still-healing wounds. That night, he called Dr. Sarah Mitchell and arranged to resume their therapy sessions, this time with Shadow included. "Healing together makes sense," Sarah agreed. "And it might help Shadow to see you working through your own responses to trauma." Meanwhile, the fight to save the shelter had intensified. Sheriff Callahan's investigation into Derek Thompson's activities had expanded to include county officials who might have been complicit in the development scheme. The local newspaper, initially reluctant to cover what seemed like small-town politics, had seized on the corruption angle with enthusiasm, running front-page stories that galvanized community support. 7 days before the scheduled closure, Abby organized an emergency town hall meeting. The high school gymnasium was packed, with community members spilling out the doors and into the parking lot. Mason arrived late, having spent nearly an hour coaxing Shadow into the truck, unwilling to leave him alone at the cabin. When they entered the gym, a hush fell over the crowd. Mason hadn't considered how their appearance would affect others. A clearly traumatized German shepherd pressed against the leg of a grim-faced veteran, both of them survivors of the same tragedy. But as whispers spread and people recognized Shadow from the missing posters that had papered the town 2 years earlier, the mood in the room shifted palpably. Abby, who had been presenting financial projections to a somewhat disengaged audience, recognized the change immediately. With a flash of inspiration, she called Mason to the microphone. "I think many of you remember the fire at Mason Reynolds' cabin 2 years ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "and how his dog Shadow was presumed dead. What you may not know is that last week, Shadow and Mason found each other again at our shelter, just days before it's scheduled to close." The crowd stirred, attention sharpening. Mason hadn't planned to speak, but found himself moving toward the microphone, Shadow matching him step for anxious step. "I lost everything in that fire," Mason said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "My home, my sense of security, and what I thought was my best friend. For 2 years, I've been rebuilding not just walls and a roof, but a life. Finding Shadow again feels like a miracle I don't deserve, but one I'm profoundly grateful for." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Shadow leaned heavily against his leg, drawing strength from the contact. "The reason Shadow and I found each other is because of this shelter. Because Abby and her team never gave up on a traumatized dog that many would have deemed unadoptable. Because volunteers spent countless hours working with him when he was too frightened to eat or interact. That's what this shelter does every day. It saves the ones others have given up on." The crowd's silence was complete now. Every face turned toward him. "Now we're being told this shelter doesn't matter," Mason continued, his voice gaining strength. "That it's just a budget item to be cut, a piece of property to be redeveloped. That the animals inside and the people who care for them are disposable." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. "Look at Shadow," Mason urged, his hand resting on the shepherd's head. 2 weeks ago, he was days away from being deemed unadoptable and transported to a facility that euthanizes animals when their time runs out. Today, he's beginning to heal, to trust again. Every animal in that shelter deserves the same chance." Abby stepped forward, building on the momentum. "We've uncovered evidence that the shelter's financial crisis was deliberately manufactured to facilitate a private development deal that would benefit certain individuals at the community's expense. Sheriff Callahan can speak to the ongoing investigation." The sheriff confirmed the investigation, careful not to name names, but making it clear that criminal charges were likely forthcoming. The gymnasium erupted in outraged conversation that quickly turned to determined problem-solving as community members offered financial support, volunteer time, and professional services. By the meeting's end, the shelter had secured enough emergency funding to remain open for 3 additional months, and a committee had formed to establish a non-profit structure that would ensure long-term sustainability. As Mason and Shadow made their way through the dispersing crowd, they were stopped repeatedly by people offering support, sharing their own rescue dog stories, or simply wanting to witness Shadow's miraculous return. The dog remained pressed against Mason, tolerating the attention with nervous dignity. One elderly woman approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Shadow with unusual intensity. "I know this dog," she said, her voice quavering with age. "He came to my back door last winter, half frozen and starving. I fed him for 3 weeks before he disappeared again. Never would come inside, but he had the gentlest eyes." Mason's throat tightened. "Thank you," he managed, "for helping him survive." "He was searching for you," the woman said with absolute certainty. "Animals know things we don't. They remember." On the drive home, Mason found himself pondering the old woman's words. Had Shadow been searching for him all this time? Had some primal connection guided the dog through wilderness and hardship, eventually leading him to the shelter where reunion became possible? As they pulled up to the cabin, Shadow's demeanor changed. For the first time since their reunion, the shepherd's posture relaxed, his tail giving a tentative wag. When Mason opened the truck door, Shadow jumped out voluntarily, moving with purpose toward the cabin door. "That's right," Mason encouraged, following behind. "This is home now, for both of us." That night, for the first time, Shadow chose to sleep on the foot of Mason's bed rather than beside it on the floor. As Mason drifted toward sleep, he felt the dog inch gradually upward until Shadow's head rested near his shoulder, a position they had often slept in before the fire. In that moment, despite the challenges still ahead, Mason felt a sense of completion he had thought forever lost in the flames 2 years ago. They had found each other against impossible odds. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The fragile peace Mason and Shadow had found was shattered 3 days later. Mason awoke to the sound of Shadow's panicked barking, a sound he hadn't heard since their reunion. The shepherd stood rigid at the bedroom door, hackles raised, his once confident warning now threaded with fear. A sharp knock at the front door explained Shadow's distress. Mason quickly pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, placing a calming hand on Shadow's head before moving to answer. The dog followed close behind, his body vibrating with tension. Sheriff Callahan stood on the porch, his weathered face grave in the early morning light. "Sorry to disturb you, Mason, but we have a situation." Mason stepped aside to let him enter, noting how Shadow retreated to the far corner of the room, watching the sheriff with wary intensity. "Derek Thompson's attorney contacted the district attorney last night," Callahan explained, declining Mason's offer of coffee. "They're challenging our investigation on procedural grounds and demanding immediate reinstatement of the shelter closure timeline." "Can they do that?" Mason asked, his stomach knotting with dread. "It's complicated." The sheriff sighed. "The evidence we have is compelling but largely circumstantial. Without direct proof of financial manipulation, they can argue this is merely a business dispute, not a criminal matter. But the development plans show poor judgment and ethical concerns, yes, but not necessarily criminal activity." Callahan removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The county commission has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They're likely to vote on whether to proceed with the shelter closure as originally planned." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. After the community rally and the promise of extended funding, they had believed the immediate threat was over. The possibility of losing this battle, just days after finding Shadow, felt like a cruel twist of fate. "What can we do?" Mason asked, glancing at Shadow, who remained huddled in his corner. "Be at that meeting," Callahan advised. "Bring Shadow if you can. Your story has resonated with people, and the commissioners need to see what's at stake." After the sheriff left, Mason sank onto the couch, mind racing. Shadow approached cautiously, resting his chin on Mason's knee in a gesture that seemed to ask what was wrong. "We're not giving up," Mason told him, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Not on the shelter, and not on you." Mason called Abby immediately. She had already heard the news and was mobilizing volunteers for the commission meeting. "Dr. Miller is concerned about Shadow's latest blood work," she told him after they had discussed strategy. "He called this morning to ask if you'd bring Shadow in before the meeting." The veterinary visit proved to be yet another blow. Shadow's physical examination revealed a developing respiratory infection, likely aggravated by stress and his previous lung damage. "The smoke inhalation from the fire did more damage than we initially thought," Dr. Miller explained as he administered antibiotics. "His lungs are compromised, making him susceptible to infection. This one's not severe yet, but I'm concerned about his overall immune response." "What does that mean long-term?" Mason asked, steadying Shadow on the examination table. The vet hesitated. "Best-case scenario, he'll need careful monitoring and likely medication for respiratory issues periodically. Worst case." He paused, his expression softening with compassion. "We could be looking at chronic respiratory disease that progressively worsens." Mason absorbed this information with a physical ache in his chest. After everything Shadow had survived, after finding each other against impossible odds, the idea that their time together might be limited by the fire's lingering damage felt unbearably cruel. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Impossible to say with certainty." Dr. Miller replied, "With proper care, nutrition, and medication, he could have many good years ahead, but his quality of life will depend on how carefully we manage his condition." Mason nodded, stroking Shadow's side as the vet completed the treatment. The shepherd seemed to sense his distress, leaning into his touch with unusual gentleness. "One day at a time," Mason murmured, as much to himself as to Shadow. "We'll take it one day at a time." The county commission meeting was held in the same high school gymnasium that had hosted the community rally, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. Instead of passionate community members, the front rows were filled with suits lawyers representing Derek Thompson and the development company, county officials looking uncomfortable, and various bureaucrats with clipboards and tablets. Mason and Abby arrived early, securing seats near the front. Shadow, wearing a special harness, identifying him as a service dog in training. Dr. Miller's suggestion to ease his entry into the public building remained pressed against Mason's leg, his eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. The proceedings began with formality that quickly devolved into thinly veiled hostility. Derek Thompson, seated at a table with two attorneys, exuded confident superiority as his legal team presented arguments for immediate reinstatement of the shelter closure. "While we sympathize with the shelter's mission," the lead attorney stated, "the financial realities cannot be ignored. The county has already extended significant resources to an operation that has demonstrated poor fiscal management." Abby bristled beside Mason, but maintained her composure as she was called to speak. Her presentation was meticulous financial projections, community pledges, and a clear transition plan for the proposed nonprofit structure. But Mason could see the commissioner's eyes glazing over as she delved into spreadsheets and budgets. When Mason's turn came, he approached the microphone slowly, Shadow matching his pace exactly. The dog's presence created an immediate ripple of interest among the commissioners, several of whom had not been present at the community rally. "This is Shadow," Mason began simply. "2 years ago, he saved my life when my cabin caught fire. For 2 years, we were separated, both of us believing the other was gone forever. 1 week ago, we found each other at the Pine Ridge shelter, the very shelter you're considering closing." Mason recounted their story succinctly, emphasizing not just the miracle of their reunion, but the shelter's critical role in it. As he spoke, one of the commissioners leaned forward, her attention caught by something. "Is your dog ill, Mr. Reynolds?" she interrupted, pointing toward Shadow, who had begun coughing, a harsh, ragged sound that echoed in the gymnasium. "Shadow has lung damage from the fire," Mason explained, kneeling to comfort the dog as the coughing fit continued. "He's currently fighting an infection because of it." The commissioner's expression softened with unexpected compassion. "My husband has COPD from years as a firefighter," she said. "That cough is all too familiar." As if on cue, Shadow's coughing worsened, his body racked with the effort to clear his damaged lungs. Dr. Miller, who had been sitting near the back, hurried forward with a small oxygen tank and mask he'd brought as a precaution. "He needs to be still," the vet instructed, fitting the mask over Shadow's muzzle. "The stress and excitement are aggravating his condition." The gymnasium fell silent as Mason held Shadow, murmuring reassurances while the dog struggled to breathe. The moment stretched, raw and unscripted, transforming what had been a bureaucratic proceeding into something profoundly human. Derek Thompson broke the silence, his voice dripping with calculated sympathy. "While this is certainly moving, it doesn't change the financial realities. Perhaps Mr. Reynolds should focus on his dog's health rather than shelter politics." The callousness of the statement hung in the air for a moment before the commissioner who had spoken earlier responded, "Mr. Thompson, my understanding is that your development proposal includes significant personal financial benefit to you." Her tone was measured but carried unmistakable steel. "Would you care to explain how that squares with your concern for county finances?" Derek's face flushed. "My business dealings are not relevant to this discussion." "I disagree," the commissioner replied. "The appearance of self-interest in a matter of public resources is entirely relevant." The meeting devolved from there into increasingly heated exchanges between Derek's legal team and the commissioners, who seemed to be finding their collective spine as public sentiment in the room clearly shifted against the development plan. Through it all, Mason remained on the floor with Shadow, focused entirely on helping the dog breathe easier. The oxygen was helping, but Shadow's distress was evident in his trembling body and the terror in his eyes. "We need to get him back to the clinic," Dr. Miller said quietly, checking Shadow's gums. "This environment is too stressful, and he needs more intensive treatment than we can provide here." Mason nodded, his heart breaking at the thought of leaving before the commission's decision. But Shadow's needs came first. As they prepared to leave, Abby squeezed his shoulder. "Go," she urged. "I'll call as soon as there's news." The next few hours passed in an agonizing blur. At the veterinary clinic, Shadow was placed in an oxygen chamber, his breathing so labored that Dr. Miller raised the possibility of emergency intubation if his condition deteriorated further. Mason refused to leave, maintaining visual contact with Shadow through the chamber's clear walls, willing his strength into the struggling dog. "Fight," he whispered, his palm pressed against the barrier between them. "Don't you dare give up now." As twilight descended, casting long shadows through the clinic windows, Mason's phone rang. Abby's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. "The commission voted to suspend the closure indefinitely," she reported. "They're launching a full investigation into the development deal and Derek's involvement." The news should have brought relief, but Mason could feel only fear as he watched Shadow's labored breathing. They had won the battle for the shelter, but he might still lose the war for Shadow's life. "He has to make it, Abby," Mason said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose him again, not like this." Through the longest night of Mason's life, Shadow fought for every breath. Dr. Miller had called in a veterinary specialist from Helena, who arrived just before midnight, bringing advanced respiratory equipment rarely used on animals. The small clinic's treatment room transformed into an intensive care unit centered around the struggling German shepherd. "His body is exhausting itself just trying to breathe," the specialist explained, her gentle hands examining Shadow through a port in the oxygen chamber. "The infection has triggered severe inflammation in his already damaged lung tissue." Mason had refused to leave despite the medical team's gentle suggestions. He sat on the cold linoleum floor beside Shadow's chamber, one hand pressed against the clear plastic whenever he wasn't being moved aside for medical procedures. The veterinarians worked around him, recognizing that separating man and dog now might do more harm than good. "Talk to him," Dr. Miller suggested during a brief, quiet moment around 3 a.m., when Shadow's condition had stabilized slightly. "He knows your voice. It might help him stay calm." So Mason talked through the night hoarse, rambling monologues about their life before the fire, about the cabin he was rebuilding, about the trails they would explore together when Shadow was well. He promised adventures and quiet evenings by the fire, described the special bed he would build to ease Shadow's breathing, vowed never to be separated again. Whether Shadow understood the words didn't matter. The dog's eyes remained fixed on Mason whenever they were open, and the monitor tracking his heart rate showed subtle calming when Mason spoke. Dawn brought cautious optimism from the medical team. The aggressive antibiotic therapy was beginning to affect the infection, and Shadow's oxygen levels had improved marginally. The immediate crisis wasn't over, but the free fall had stopped. "He's got fight in him," the specialist observed, reviewing the overnight charts. "More than I expected, given his condition. He survived 2 years in the wild after saving me from a fire," Mason replied, his voice raw from talking through the night. "Fighting is what he does." By mid-morning, Shadow had improved enough that Dr. Miller felt comfortable leaving to check on his other patients, promising to return in a few hours. The specialist remained, monitoring Shadow's IV medications and oxygen levels. Abby arrived shortly after, carrying coffee and sandwiches that Mason accepted gratefully, though he couldn't remember when he'd last eaten. She settled beside him on the floor, her presence a quiet comfort as they watched Shadow's chest rise and fall with less effort than before. "The community is asking about him," she said after a while. "Word spread about what happened at the meeting. People want to help." Mason nodded, too exhausted for more response. The emotional whiplash of the past week finding Shadow, the shelter crisis, and now this medical emergency had left him drained beyond words. "Derek's been suspended from the bank pending investigation," Abby continued, sensing Mason needed distraction. "The development company has withdrawn their proposal entirely. They're claiming they had no knowledge of his manipulation of the shelter situation. Under different circumstances, this news would have felt like victory. Now, it barely registered against the more urgent battle for Shadow's life." Around noon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the clinic. Sheriff Callahan entered quietly, removing his hat as he approached Shadow's chamber. The dog's eyes tracked the movement, but without the panic he'd shown previously, whether from familiarity or simply exhaustion. Mason couldn't tell. "Thought you could use this," the sheriff said, handing Mason a small paper bag. Inside was Shadow's old collar, miraculously intact though blackened by smoke. Mason had thought it lost in the fire. "Where did you find this?" he asked, running his fingers over the worn leather. "In the evidence locker from the fire investigation," Callahan explained. "Should have been returned to you with the other salvaged items. Paperwork mix-up, I guess. Found it this morning while looking for something else." Mason carefully opened the oxygen chamber just enough to slip the collar inside, placing it near Shadow's nose. The dog's response was immediate. His nostrils flared as he caught the scent, and his tail gave a weak thump against the chamber floor. "That's the first time he's wagged his tail since yesterday," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. The sheriff nodded, understanding the significance. "Dogs remember. Sense of smell is tied to the most primitive part of their brain, strongest memory trigger there is." Throughout the afternoon, Shadow continued his slow improvement. By evening, he was able to maintain acceptable oxygen levels with a nasal cannula rather than the full chamber, allowing Mason to finally touch him directly. "We're cautiously optimistic," Dr. Miller told Mason as they transferred Shadow to a padded treatment table, still connected to monitors and IV lines. "His response to treatment has been better than expected. The next 24 hours will tell us more about long-term prognosis." That night, Mason slept on the floor beside Shadow's table, his hand resting on the dog's paw. For the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to truly sleep. Shadow's improved breathing a lullaby that carried him into dreamless rest. He woke to the gentle pressure of Shadow's nose against his cheek, a familiar gesture from their life before the fire. The dog was still weak, still connected to oxygen and IVs, but had somehow managed to stretch his neck down to reach Mason's face. "Hey, buddy," Mason whispered, his heart swelling as Shadow's tail gave a slightly stronger wag in response. "You're going to be okay, aren't you? You're too stubborn to give up." The improvement continued steadily over the next 2 days. Shadow's cough lingered but became more productive, clearing his lungs of infection. His appetite returned gradually, and with it, more of his personality, the alert intelligence in his eyes, the expressive tilt of his ears, the subtle shifts in posture that Mason recognized as pure Shadow. On the 3rd day, Dr. Miller presented Mason with a comprehensive treatment plan for Shadow's long-term care. "The damage to his lungs is permanent," he explained, reviewing the latest X-rays. "He'll always be vulnerable to respiratory infections, and he'll likely have exercise limitations. But with proper management, there's no reason he can't have a good quality of life for years to come." The prescribed regimen was daunting: daily medications, breathing treatments, careful monitoring of exertion, avoidance of smoke and other irritants, but Mason absorbed every detail, committed to whatever Shadow needed. "When can I take him home?" he asked, watching Shadow doze on his treatment table, oxygen flowing through a nasal cannula, but otherwise looking remarkably improved. "Tomorrow, if his progress continues," Dr. Barr Miller replied, "but I'd like you to bring him in twice weekly for the next month so we can monitor his recovery closely." The next morning, as Mason prepared to take Shadow home, Abby arrived at the clinic with unexpected news. "The shelter board met last night," she announced, her expression a mix of excitement and disbelief. With Derek removed, they voted unanimously to pursue the nonprofit transition immediately. And they want to create a special program for rehabilitation of traumatized animals. They're calling it the Shadow Program. Mason looked down at Shadow, who was sitting patiently as Dr. Miller removed his IV. "What do you think, buddy? Want to have a program named after you?" Shadow's response was a soft woof, his first vocalization since the health crisis began. "I'll take that as a yes," Mason laughed, the sound rusty with disuse. "Though I'm not sure how much volunteering we'll be doing while you're recovering." "Actually," Abby hesitated, "the board was hoping you might consider a more formal role. They've created a position for a rehabilitation specialist to run the program. The job is yours if you want it." The offer caught Mason completely off guard. His carpentry work had always been a means to an end, not a calling. Working with traumatized animals, applying the skills he'd developed with military dogs, and now with Shadow. It resonated in a way few things had since his return from Afghanistan. "I'd need a flexible schedule," he said, thinking aloud. "At least while Shadow's recovering." "We can work with that," Abby assured him. "The program won't launch fully for a few months anyway. Plenty of time for Shadow to get stronger and for you to develop the training protocols." As they drove home later that morning, Shadow sat in the passenger seat rather than cowering on the floor, a small victory that made Mason's chest tight with emotion. The dog wore his old collar, restored as much as possible by Mason's careful cleaning, a tangible connection to their shared past. At the cabin, Shadow stepped from the truck with newfound confidence, surveying the property with alert interest rather than fear. He was still thin, still moved with care to avoid taxing his damaged lungs, but there was purpose in his posture that had been missing before. Mason observed this transformation with wonder. Despite all Shadow had endured the fire, 2 years in the wilderness, the recent health crisis, the essential core of the dog remained intact. Changed, certainly. Scarred, undeniably, but undefeated. That evening, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset, an unexpected visitor emerged from the tree line, a young deer, cautiously approaching the clearing around the cabin. Mason remained perfectly still, expecting Shadow to alert or show interest. Instead, the shepherd merely observed the deer with calm awareness, showing none of the prey drive that would have once sent him charging. "You learned to live with them, didn't you?" Mason murmured, understanding dawning. "Out there in the wild, you had to adapt." Shadow glanced up at Mason, then back at the deer, his expression almost contemplative. In that moment, Mason glimpsed something profound about their parallel journeys. Both had survived fire and loss. Both had navigated wilderness shadow in the literal mountains. Mason in the landscape of grief and PTSD. Both had emerged changed but intact, with new wisdom born of suffering. The deer eventually wandered away, unharassed. Shadow settled his head on Mason's knee with a contented sigh that contained only the faintest wheeze. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to an impossible reunion that defied explanation, yet felt, to Mason, like the most natural thing in the world. Against all odds, they had found each other. Against all odds, they would heal together. They would heal. And for the first time since the fire, Mason felt not just hope, but certainty that whatever came next, they would face it as they were always meant to, side by side. 1 year later, the mid-May sunshine bathed Pine Ridge in golden light as Mason stood at the entrance to the newly renovated animal shelter. The weathered sign reading Pine Ridge County Animal Shelter had been replaced with a polished wooden plaque, Shadow's Haven, Community Animal Rehabilitation Center. Beside him, Shadow sat attentively, his coat glossy and full once more, though he remained leaner than before his ordeal. A specialized vest identified him as both a therapy dog and the shelter's official ambassador. "Ready for the grand opening, buddy?" Mason asked, adjusting his tie, a concession to Abby's insistence that, as program director, he should look the part for today's ceremony. Shadow's response was a soft woof and an expectant gaze toward the parking lot, where cars had been arriving steadily for the past hour. The shelter's transformation over the past year had become a point of community pride, drawing support from far beyond Pine Ridge's borders after their story spread through regional news and social media. "There you are," Abby called, hurrying toward them from the direction of the newly constructed training yard. "The mayor just arrived, and the photographer from the Tribune wants to get some shots before the ribbon cutting." Mason smiled at her flustered efficiency. In the year since Shadow's health crisis, Abby had thrown herself into the shelter's transformation with tireless dedication. As executive director of the new nonprofit, she had secured grants, rallied volunteers, and overseen renovations that had transformed the dilapidated facility into a model of modern animal care. The stress had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they only seemed to enhance the warmth of her smile, a smile that Mason had come to treasure more with each passing day. "We'll be right there," he promised, reaching for her hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. The gesture drew a quick flush to her cheeks and a knowing look from Shadow, who had witnessed the gradual evolution of their relationship from professional collaboration to something much deeper. The ceremony itself exceeded all expectations. Nearly half the town turned out to celebrate the shelter's rebirth, along with reporters from 3 counties and representatives from state animal welfare organizations. Mayor Harris spoke eloquently about community responsibility and second chances. Dr. Miller detailed the innovative medical protocols developed for traumatized animals. Abby outlined the shelter's new mission and sustainable funding model. When Mason's turn came to speak, he found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him to this podium. Just over a year ago, he had been a solitary man, rebuilding a burnt cabin and a fragmented life. Now, he stood before a community that had become like family, with Shadow solid and present at his side. "The Shadow program isn't just about rehabilitating traumatized animals," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his chest. "It's about recognizing that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story for animals or for people." He outlined the program's unique approach, pairing rescued animals with veterans and trauma survivors for mutual rehabilitation. Already, 3 dogs from the program had been placed with veterans in the region, with life-changing results for both human and canine partners. "What Shadow taught me," Mason continued, glancing down at the German shepherd who maintained perfect position beside him, is that healing isn't about returning to who we were before. It's about becoming something new that honors what we've survived. As if on cue, Shadow gave a soft cough, the lingering reminder of his damaged lungs that would always be part of him. Mason reached down automatically, stroking the dog's head until the brief spell passed. Not everything can be fixed, Mason acknowledged to the crowd. Shadow's lungs will always bear the scars of the fire that separated us. But he's adapted. He's found ways to live fully within his new limitations. That's the model for the work we do here, not denying trauma's lasting impact, but finding the path forward anyway. After the ceremony, as guests toured the renovated facility, Mason found himself cornered by a reporter from the state newspaper. "There's been quite a bit of interest in your story," she explained, digital recorder in hand. "People are calling it miraculous finding each other after 2 years. Shadow's recovery against the odds, the shelter's transformation. Some are even saying it was fate or divine intervention. What do you think made it all possible?" Mason considered the question carefully, watching Shadow work the crowd several feet away. The dog moved with deliberate care to preserve his energy, but showed none of the fear that had once dominated his existence. Children patted his head while he submitted to the attention with dignified patience, gently disengaging when it became too much and returning to Mason's side for brief respites. "I don't know if I'd call it miraculous," Mason finally answered. "Shadow survived because he's extraordinary, his training, his intelligence, his will to live. The shelter was saved because good people refused to accept that money matters more than compassion. And me." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think I survived because Shadow gave me a reason to keep looking forward, even when I thought he was gone. And your relationship with Ms. Whitaker?" the reporter asked with a knowing smile. "The rumor is there might be wedding bells in the future." Mason laughed, glancing across the room where Abby was deep in conversation with potential donors. "No comment on that one, but I will say that Shadow approves, and his vote counts double." As the crowd thinned and the afternoon lengthened into evening, Mason, Abby, and Shadow retreated to the shelter's new office to decompress before the volunteer appreciation dinner scheduled for later. "I'd call today a success," Abby sighed, slipping off her heels and curling into the corner of the office sofa. Shadow immediately claimed the space beside her, resting his head on her lap with presumptive familiarity that made Mason smile. More than a success, Mason agreed, loosening his tie as he settled into the adjacent chair. "Did you see the donation total? We funded the expansion project and the medical wing." Abby nodded, her fingers absently stroking Shadow's ears. "I still can't quite believe how far we've come in a year." Neither spoke for a moment, both contemplating the improbable journey from crisis to celebration. The silence was comfortable, filled with shared understanding that needed no words. Finally, Abby broke the quiet. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you. Both of you. Actually." Her tone shifted, suddenly serious enough that Shadow lifted his head, eyes alert. "That sounds ominous," Mason teased, though he felt a flutter of anticipation. "The opposite, I hope." Abby straightened, suddenly looking nervous. "My lease is up next month, and I was thinking your cabin has that extra room you've been using for storage, and the commute to town is so much shorter from your place than mine, and Shadow already has his special bed set up there, and—" "Abby," Mason interrupted gently, moving to kneel beside the sofa. "Are you asking to move in with us?" She nodded, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "It's probably too soon, and I completely understand if—" This time Shadow interrupted, placing a paw precisely on her knee and making direct eye contact in the way Mason had taught him to communicate important messages. "I think that's a yes from Shadow." Mason laughed, taking Abby's hand. "And it's a definite yes from me, too. I've actually been trying to figure out how to ask you the same thing." The tension in Abby's shoulders melted away as she leaned forward to kiss him, much to Shadow's apparent approval as the dog gave a satisfied sigh and settled more comfortably between them. Later that night, after the volunteer dinner had concluded and the day's excitement had finally wound down, Mason, Abby, and Shadow drove home to the cabin under a sky brilliant with stars. The structure bore little resemblance to Mason's original home. It was smaller but more thoughtfully designed, with special accommodations for Shadow's needs, including an air filtration system and graduated ramps that allowed him to reach his favorite lookout spots without taxing his lungs. As they settled in for the night, Shadow performed his customary security check of the property before taking his place on his orthopedic bed near the wood stove, cold now in the late spring warmth, but still his preferred location. Mason had learned not to question these small habits that tied Shadow to his past self. "He seems especially content tonight," Abby observed, watching the dog from the doorway. "Do you think he understands what today meant?" Mason considered the question, watching Shadow arrange himself with deliberate care, his breathing even but audible in the quiet room. "I think he understands more than we realize," he replied. "Not the specifics, maybe, but the feeling of it completion, purpose, coming full circle." That night, Mason dreamed of the fire for the first time in months. But unlike the nightmares that had once tormented him, this dream was different. He saw the flames clearly, felt their heat, heard the crash of falling timbers, but there was no fear, no desperation. Instead, he watched with calm clarity as Shadow pushed him to safety. Then witnessed what he had never seen before, Shadow's own escape through a burning wall that collapsed behind him. His desperate search through the woods, disoriented by smoke and injury, unable to find his way back. The dream shifted to Shadow's years in the wild hunting for food, seeking shelter in abandoned buildings, approaching humans cautiously only to be chased away. Through it all ran a constant thread of searching, a pull toward something Shadow couldn't name but could feel, drawing him gradually closer to Pine Ridge and eventually to the shelter where reunion became possible. Mason woke just before dawn, the dream still vivid in his mind. Beside him, Abby slept peacefully, her hand curled around his arm. At the foot of the bed where Shadow had never previously slept due to his preference for the wood stove, the German shepherd lay awake, watching Mason with knowing eyes. "You found your way back," Mason whispered, reaching down to touch the dog's head. "Against everything, you found your way home." Shadow rose carefully and stretched, his movements measured to accommodate his damaged lungs, then padded to the bedroom door and looked back expectantly. Mason slipped from bed without waking Abby and followed the dog outside onto the porch. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the mountains silhouetted against the first hint of dawn. Shadow led the way down the porch steps and along a path they had walked many times, but with unusual purpose that made Mason curious. They climbed the gentle slope behind the cabin to a small clearing that offered a view of the valley below, including the distant rooftops of Pine Ridge. Shadow stopped at the highest point, sitting with dignified poise as he gazed out over the landscape. Mason settled beside him on a fallen log, content to share whatever moment the dog was creating. As the first rays of sunlight crested the distant peaks, illuminating the valley in golden light, Shadow lifted his head and gave voice to a sound Mason had never heard from him before. Not quite a howl, not quite a bark, but something ancient and wild that seemed to bridge the gap between the domesticated companion at his side and the survivor who had lived by instinct and will in these mountains. The sound sent a shiver down Mason's spine, not from fear, but from a profound sense of privilege at witnessing something deeply personal. When Shadow fell silent, he turned to Mason with an expression that seemed to say, "Now you understand." And Mason did understand. With sudden clarity, Shadow had brought him here, to this vantage point at sunrise, to show him the territory of his wilderness years, the landscape of his survival, and his long journey home. It was both an offering and a completion, closing the circle of their separation and reunion. "Thank you," Mason said simply, his voice rough with emotion, "for finding me, for not giving up." Shadow leaned against Mason's leg, his solid warmth a grounding presence as the sun rose fully over the mountains. Below in the valley, Pine Ridge awakened to a new day, the shelter that bore Shadow's name ready to receive animals in need of second chances, veterans seeking connection, and a community that had learned the value of fighting for things that mattered. Together, man and dog watched the day begin, their shared silence containing all the words that needed saying. The road behind them had been long and marked with suffering, but the path ahead promised something neither had dared hope for in their darkest moments, not just survival, but a life made richer by the very wounds they carried, transformed now into wisdom and purpose. In the gentle light of dawn, it felt less like an ending than a beginning. When we reach our golden years, we understand that life's greatest lessons often come wrapped in heartache. Shadow and Mason's journey reminds us that it's never too late for a miracle in our lives. Like this faithful German shepherd who survived against impossible odds, we too have weathered storms that once seemed insurmountable: loss of loved ones, health challenges, dreams deferred. Yet there remains in each of us that same stubborn spark that kept Shadow searching for 2 long years. How many of us have felt abandoned, forgotten, or too damaged to be loved again? How many have resigned ourselves to living with the scars of our past, believing our best days are behind us? Shadow's story whispers a powerful truth. Our wounds don't disqualify us from purpose. They prepare us for it. Every breath Shadow fought for, every step Mason took toward healing, proves that what matters isn't returning to who we once were, but honoring who we've become through survival. Your life experience, even the painful chapters, has value beyond measure, like Shadow finding his way home against all odds. Your journey still has moments of reunion, purpose, and unexpected joy waiting to unfold. The path forward is illuminated by the very light that helped you survive the darkness.